Hello everyone, and welcome to the third part of my One Night in Karazhan card review. There were so many cards that were revealed to us at the, reveal event just last weekend that I wanted to break things up so I wasn't just going through tons of them at once. So we're going to talk about the neutral cards first. So here we go. The first card I want to talk about is Arcane Giant. This is an 8/8 for 12, sort of in the Molten Giant, Mountain Giant, Frost Giant, Sea Giant theme, that it costs less for some sort of effect. This is for each spell that you've played this game. Now this is a card that's clearly very reminiscent of Frost Giant specifically because it has a cost reduction effect that incrementally increases as you do a certain game action. Frost Giant is a card that I was actually pretty excited about when it was first revealed, but ended up being not really a particularly exciting card in most decks. There were some fringe decks that did end up using Frost Giant, but I think the big problem with it was always that using your hero power, which is the cost reduction for Frost Giant, is kind of inefficient. If your deck is not operating kind of on all cylinders, then maybe Frost Giant is good, but obviously if your deck is not operating on all cylinders to enable this card, you're giving up something else in terms of efficiency up to that point. Arcane Giant, though, if you're able to operate efficiently and play a bunch of spells, especially say a bunch of spells that may draw you more cards to draw more spells, can be a very powerful card. And there are like a lot of controlling style decks that would be very spell heavy that I could easily imagine this card fitting into. Control Mage, Control Priest. You know, while this is not a priest card, this is one of the cards that I think may facilitate stronger priest decks with the release of the adventure, simply because the ability to generate a powerful offense while still playing reactive cards is something that control decks really appreciate, really like to be able to do, and Arcane Giant does exactly that. I would not be surprised to see this card show up in a number of experimental competitive decks pretty early on, and I think that it might have what it takes to remain a top contender. Well, speaking of exciting, powerful experimental cards, Medivh the Guardian. This is, obviously the sort of namesake of the Medivh's party, and this is a card that I think is certainly really cool. The 8-drop 7/7, obviously the stats by itself, not super exciting, but the fact that it does put a meaningful body into play on its own is, of course, valuable. The battle cry is what's mostly exciting about this, equipping Atiesh, Great Staff of the Guardian, which is essentially a 3-charge Summoning Stone weapon. Summoning Stone is a card that I'm a huge fan of, and is a very powerful effect. Of course, the problem with Summoning Stone is that it's a 0/6 minion, so it can pretty easily just get killed and not necessarily have a great effect on the board. But with Medivh, you can be more likely to actually get multiple triggers from the effect, simply because it's much more difficult for people to naturally interact with a weapon. It does have some drawbacks, of course. This is a card that may go into sort of non-weapon classes like Priest or Mage, and in those instances, your opponent may have something like Harrison Jones or an Acidic Swamp Ooze that they're kind of holding on to that can deal with the Atiesh and prevent you from getting that effect. It obviously also is not particularly great with cheap spells, which are most of the spells you generally want to play. I've seen some people talk about, you can play Hunter and play Medivh into Call of the Wild. It's like, you know what? When you're playing Call of the Wild, you don't need that much help. I see this as being sort of at its strongest in decks that do have kind of mid to expensive cost spells like Entombs and Flame Strikes that can trigger this and give you both the powerful spell effect as well as a substantial minion in the same turn. So it's hard for me to evaluate this particular card, but I know that I'm going to be building decks that will be utilizing it, because the kind of decks that I like to play are exactly the kind of decks that want this sort of effect. Controlling decks that do have those more expensive late game spells. So I'm definitely excited about it, and do think that it has the potential to possibly show up in legitimate competitive play. All right, Moat Lurker. This is, I think, one of the most interesting cards in the entire adventure. It's got Battle Cry to destroy a minion, and Death Rattle resummon it. 6 cost 3/3. This is a card that is obviously reminiscent of cards in other games. This is basically Fiend Hunter or Oblivion Ring from Magic the Gathering. makes the creature go away when it comes into play, makes the creature come back when it goes away. It's important to note that the effect that causes the creature to be resummoned is a death rattle. So there's a number of ways to get around it. For instance, with Moat Lurker, you can use it alongside Pandaren Brewmaster and end up just killing creatures repeatedly with Moat Lurker. Kind of like you could sacrifice the old Fiend Hunter to make your opponent's guy go away forever when the ability was in the stack. Little specific tricks that can allow you to take advantage of it. Also happens to work very well with Evolve from Shaman, because the Moat Lurker will turn into a 7-drop, which is pretty powerful to begin with. Getting Kill Your Guy become a 7-drop could be the sort of thing that enables Evolve Shaman decks to become more powerful. It's also just potentially a very powerful sort of tempo style of card, being able to remove, say, an Ancient of War. And you just hit your opponent in the face, and even if they kill the Moat Lurker, well, they don't get the Battle Cry effect on the Ancient of War anymore, so it's much less potent than it could be. And it does force your opponent to react to the Moat Lurker as well. The fact that you can use it on your own minions is also quite powerful. Obviously, something like a Cairn or a Sylvanas, being able to trigger your own death rattle, or even just use it on a damaged minion to effectively heal it and bring it back once the Moat Lurker dies. So lots of ways to utilize this card. It is a 6-cost 3/3, so there's got to be a big upside to actually decide to put this card into a deck, but I know that this is a card that I will be experimenting with, and would not be surprised to see it show up a lot in competitive play. Avian Watcher. This is another card that I'm actually quite excited about. So many of the decks that I like to play the most are things like Control Mage. I've mentioned this already with Arcane Giant and Medivh, but this is a very, very strong card, obviously just from a stat perspective. A 4/7 taunt for 5. As far as comparisons, like, that's basically a Sludge Belcher. Obviously, it doesn't have the fact that anything can hit it for the first time and then it still leaves behind a 1/2. But you're getting effectively the same total stats that you got from Sludge Belcher, and that's obviously a really big deal, because Sludge Belcher was a hugely impactful card. Does require you to control Secret. This is going to be at its best, I think, in Ice Block decks, Control Mage type decks, because that's the most likely you can kind of guarantee yourself to have access to a secret throughout the game to trigger this. But it could also, potentially find a home in more defensively oriented Hunter decks. It could also, clearly find a home in some sort of Paladin decks, because you can easily play a 1-cost secret, or a secret that isn't necessarily easily triggered by your opponent, to enable the Avian Watcher. I imagine that this will most likely show up primarily in controlling mage decks, because they do have the most reliable secrets to keep in play, specifically Ice Block. But this is definitely a very significant defensive minion stat-wise, and that's something that can really help those decks come together where they need to. All right, Menagarie Magician. I had a chance to actually play around with this at the Karazhan reveal event. I was playing on some of the demo decks there. It was really, by the way, a very funny event. They didn't tell us anything going into it. Just sort of asked me, hey, can you come to this event? You have to sign an NDA. You can't tell anyone that you're coming or anything about it. I'm like, okay. But the Menagarie Magician, I had a chance to play with a deck that was built around it, that was a Paladin deck. And it actually made me realize that my previous review of Zubot was kind of off base, because I actually had read it as you can give one of these things +1/+1, but both of them are an and effect. So building a deck that has beasts and dragons and murlocs, you can potentially get significantly bigger bonus spread across your team from both of these cards. I think that Zubot is still just not necessarily an incredibly powerful card. I think it's a solid card for a deck that can take advantage of even just one bonus. This one, though, really the fact that it's a 5-cost 4/4, obviously a very inefficient body on its own, but giving +2/+2 is pretty huge. I don't think that it's likely we'll see competitive decks that are really built around this, if only because it's difficult to keep multiple minions in play and then also play something else. Hearthstone's a game where the way that the tempo often works in most matchups is that you sort of go back and forth with each player, largely removing most of what the opposing player has put into play on any given turn. which makes things that require a certain game state like this one a little bit more difficult to effectively utilize. But this is a very powerful effect. If you have 2 things that get a bonus from this, not even the full 3, you're getting effectively 8/8 worth of stats for 5, which is a lot. One thing that a lot of people don't really think about necessarily when they talk about the sort of total stats, and value you get for your cost, is how much of that can immediately attack. If you have Menagarie Magician and you have 2 things that are already in play, say a beast and a dragon, you play the Menagarie Magician, and yes, you get 8/8 worth of stats for 5, which is very good, but also +2/+2 of that, 4 points of that can immediately attack, and that's a huge deal. So the impact of boosting your team and getting the additional body, and also sort of spreading out the stats, can be very valuable against removal as well. So I do think this is a very powerful card. As to whether the conditions will exist in the metagame, mostly ever in Hearthstone, for this kind of effect to be particularly powerful, is unclear to me. So I don't have particularly high hopes for this card, but I do like the fact that it pushes deck building in a certain way that will encourage people to look at cards differently in terms of what they actually want from a card, rather than necessarily just its raw stats. It's like, oh, well, this is a beast, I need a beast for my deck. This is a Murloc, I need a Murloc for my deck. And all these things together make things more powerful. I think that makes deck building much more interesting when you care about more than just the raw rate you're getting with the stats of the minions and such. All right, Arcanosmith. This is kind of a weird card. It's just a 3/2 for 4. Obviously, pretty bad stats, but Battle Cry, summon a 0/5 minion with Taunt. They won't tell us what kind of minion it is. It's kind of weird. I don't know. It looks like it's kind of a shield-looking thing. The wording on a lot of Hearthstone cards is strange like that. It's like Morose, for instance, says summon a 1/1 Steward. This is just summon a 0/5 minion with Taunt. This is one of those cards where you think about the raw stats you get from something. It's like, yeah, you sort of get 3/7 worth of stats from this, but the 5 health Taunt that you get has no attack, so it just is sort of a buffer for your other minions and yourself. The 3/2, sort of disassociated from this. Is this better in some capacity than a Sen'jin Shieldmaster? If your goal is simply to protect your board presence, maybe it kind of is, because your opponent kills your 5 health Taunt, doesn't affect the 3 attack that kind of came along with it. It's difficult for me to imagine that being more attractive than a Sen'jin Shieldmaster would be, because so much of what the sort of onboard combat is just minions attacking to other minions, and the fact that they don't die attacking into the 0/5 Taunt makes that much less appealing in most cases than just having a Sen'jin Shieldmaster would be. So my inclination is this is probably not going to be a card that really sees much play. All right, Pantry Spider. It's basically a 1/3 that makes another 1/3, so 2 different 1/3 bodies for 3. It's worth noting that they are beasts, so this is a potentially strong card for decks that are built around beast synergy. Whether this is better than something like Carrion Grub for a hunter deck looking to use Houndmaster is probably not really the case. It's potentially a card that is effective in decks that are looking to use the Menagarie Magician or Zubat, because it does split up your beast bodies so that you can have a greater chance of having one of them in play to buff with your Menagerie boosting cards. That said, it's just pretty inefficient, and it would be difficult for me to imagine justifying playing this over just a better statted minion in even those decks that are looking for it. So if there's some reason that you specifically want multiple guys, maybe you're a Reliquary Seeker deck, but it feels like there are better options that you can get kind of no matter what in that case. So not really a card that I expect to see any significant constructed play. All right, Violet Illusionist. This is a really interesting card. 4/3 for 3. During your turn, your hero is immune. I actually suggested that a card like this would be great for rogues who were looking to have some sort of effect to allow them to play a more controlling game. Rogues in Hearthstone have pretty universally had to be tempo styles of decks, simply because it's a class that heavily utilizes their hero power to use their health as a resource, and yet doesn't have any kind of healing effect. And healing is kind of out of character for rogues, so is armor. But something like this, that your hero can't be damaged during your own turn, you're sneaking up and stabbing someone, whatever. I think that this is definitely a very exciting card for decks that are looking to utilize their life total as a resource on their own turn, whether by attacking into opposing minions, could be used alongside life tap in a Warlock deck. The stats aren't necessarily great. The fact that it is a 4/3 for 3 makes this weaker for the kind of decks I feel like would want this than if it had been a 3/4 for 3, simply because it's a more aggressive card that gets traded up with more easily by 3/2s for 2. Whereas if it was a 3/4 for 3, it would not necessarily be killed by lower drops quite as easily. Also not being killed by Fiery War Axe or Spirit Claws or Frostbolt. These are all pretty significant flashpoints between 3 and 4. And I feel like this is a more controlling style of card, and it has more sort of aggressive stats, which makes it a little bit confused in my mind. So obviously powerful with stuff like Doomhammer or the new Fool's Bane card that we will talk about in a bit. But yeah, overall, I like the concept of the card. I just think that the specifics of the execution leave it in a weird space that it wants to be aggressive in terms of its stats, but is a card text that feels like it fits into a more controlling style of deck. So it's kind of weird for me to imagine what sort of home this would have due to those sort of conflicts. It's definitely a card that is interesting, but I'm not sure it will really find a home. All right, so Netherspite Historian. This is a card a lot of people have asked me about in terms of my opinion, and unfortunately my opinion is that I don't think this card is particularly good. I want to like it. I definitely do. But this card is very reminiscent to me of Museum Curator. Museum Curator is a card that I actually saw a lot of play in Priest decks prior to Standard, in part because there were so many good Death Rattle minions for Priest at the time. It would almost always get you something like Dark Cultist, Sludge Belcher, Death Lord, or Piloted Shredder. Obviously, there are pretty good dragons that are available. Most of them are still pretty expensive. So the chances that you get a 3-drop, for instance, off of Netherspite Historian to fill out your curve, pretty much non-existent. There aren't 3-drop dragons. The other big issue in terms of why you saw a lot of Museum Curator before and don't right now is that there was Velen's Chosen when Museum Curator was available alongside so many good Death Rattle minions, which made the 1/2 for 2 a very relevant body. Netherspite Historian won 3 for 2. Obviously not just a Priest card, but I'm thinking about it in the terms of a lot of Dragon decks. One of the most played Dragon decks is Dragon Priest, or at least it was until Dragon Warrior just kind of became the thing. And Dragon Warrior isn't really a deck that's interested in this effect either. Dragon Warrior is a very tempo-oriented deck. It wants to play things out quickly and aggressively and pressure the opponent, and obviously a 1/3 for 2 doesn't do any of those things. So in order for this to be a card that you want in your deck, instead of, say, just a different dragon, you need to have some use for the 1/3 body for 2. And without Velen's Chosen, I don't feel like there's really a great place for Priests to really care about that. You just end up kind of making your deck more based on the dragon synergies, because if you have a Netherspite Historian and no dragon card in your hand, it's a totally terrible card. If you do have a dragon, obviously you can play a 1/3, effectively get a free 1/3 for 2, and then maybe somehow fill out your curve in some way. Again, it's important to remember that there are not that many things low on the curve as far as dragons are concerned, so this is not going to be able to fill out your curve in quite the same way that some other Discover cards might be able to. But if you can take advantage of the 1/3 body for 2, I think this could be potentially a pretty powerful card. Again, if we maybe find some sort of creature enchantments like Velen's Chosen, or if we're playing this in something other than Priest, like for instance, if we played this in Dragon Mage. I see this as kind of like a Babbling Book type card as far as Dragon Mage might be concerned. I think that Babbling Book, as I talked about in my previous review, is good in Mage because of the value of just having a body that can do some incremental damage to an opposing minion in Mage due to the hero power Fire Blast. That's not really the same thing in most classes. For instance, Priest has no good way to deal that additional incremental damage, so having the 1/3 that maybe deals 1 damage to your opponent's 3/2, not particularly valuable. But if you played this in a Dragon Mage style deck, it can potentially have a board presence that has some sort of impact that allows you to get kind of a hard advantage over your opponent, because your 1/3 attacks their 3/2, you ping it, ta-da, you effectively drew a card from the Discover effect. I think that if either of those things turns out to be the case, that you have ways to use the 1/3 body, or again, if perhaps there are more aggressive 2/1 minions in the format. It's kind of the same thing that I talked about with Museum Curator previously as well, was that a lot of the value of Museum Curator when it was popular was the fact that there were so many Leper Gnomes and Abusive Sergeants and Worgen Infiltrators when Face Hunter was so popular, that just having this incidental body that you could play that would trade with one of those, as well as discover you a card, had some value. That's less true now that more of the aggressive decks are playing Tunnel Trogs and Totem Golems and Giant Toads than are playing Leper Gnomes and Worgen Infiltrators. So, unfortunately, as much as I want to love every Dragon synergy card that exists, my general thought is that Netherspite Historian is not going to be a especially effective card, and will not likely find its way into many of my Dragon decks. Arcane Anomaly. It's a 2/1/4/1 that whenever you cast a spell, it gets +1 health. Kind of an opposite Mana Worm effect. And this is an interesting card in control decks. It's kind of, in some cases, going to feel like a Zombie Chow, in that you want to play this in a control deck that has a lot of spells, obviously, that can help buff it, just for early defense. It's not nearly as inherently resilient to, say, hero powers or other minions that Zombie Chow might be, but obviously it doesn't have the same drawback late in the game Zombie Chow has for healing your opponent when it dies. This is a card that obviously pairs well with cantrip type spells, things like Powered Shield. Being able to generate a big early minion for a sort of mid-range controlling style of priest deck feels like the sort of thing that could be quite valuable. And also just the fact that it doesn't require necessarily that support to actually have a role against a lot of aggressive decks. Just trading your 1-drop Arcane Anomaly for your opponent's, say, King's Elec, is actually very valuable, because you're not falling behind in tempo like you might otherwise. So I think that this is a card that could find a home in mid-range controlling style spell-heavy decks, just as potential proactive early interaction that can also potentially pressure your opponent in instances where that's relevant. So I don't think this is going to be a real standout like Zombie Chow was, showing up in a ton of decks, but I definitely think that it is potential role player in some decks in competitive play. So Runic Egg, a 0/2/1 with Death Rattle, draw card. So this is a weird card because it's obviously not particularly effective on its own. You need something to enable it to even get the Death Rattle effect. It is only a 1-cost card, so it is something that you can pretty easily fit into curve somewhere. But you need to have some way like Abusive Sergeant, Power Overwhelming, or area effect cards to kill it in order to trigger its Death Rattle. My feeling is that this is probably not a card that's going to see a whole lot of play, because in decks that do have combat tricks, that have the Abusive Sergeants, the Power Overwhelmings, they generally care more about getting bodies on the board rather than they do about just sort of getting these incremental card advantage over their opponent with something like, expend my mana and trade my 0/2 that draws me a card with your 3/2 or whatever. Though it is possible that this does end up in sort of mid-rangey, maybe Shaman type decks, because you have access to Flame Tongue plus Rockbiter, which can allow this to sort of give you at least marginal advantage over some decks. Obviously, pairing this with Rockbiter, you're still spending the Rockbiter effectively, but it does protect some damage from your face, whatever else. It also, of course, can be triggered by your own sort of AoE effects, and maybe you're playing a deck that's looking to cycle through your deck quickly. Maybe you're playing a deck that cares about having these Death Rattle effects, whatever else. Of course, you have a lot of options for just cycling through your deck that don't require enablers. There are things like Novice Engineer, Loot Hoarder, Acolyte of Pain. So because there's so many good ways to sort of draw and cycle already, I don't necessarily think that this is going to be a card that will find a home in decks that are looking for that. And because there's so many good sort of options for early minions for decks that are looking to sort of effectively use combat boosts, I don't really feel like it's going to go into decks that are looking for that. It feels like, decks that are looking to throw an egg into combat would probably go to Dragon Egg instead, because they'd rather have the board presence than just a card in their hand. But, it's definitely a weird card that I think that players will experiment with. And my guess is that there won't be any competitive decks that come from it, but Who knows? We'll see. So that is all of the neutral cards that have been revealed from One Night in Karazhan. If you missed any from my previous reviews, you can go back and check those out. And anyway, I'm going to move on to doing the class cards, which you can check out here.